Hi, good morning, everyone. David Cross here. Not even sure where to start with today's video. I had to take a couple of days and early mornings and evenings to kind of work through this example. I had gotten to the point where I was working with a much larger server configuration file that I had self-generated and started noticing some of the asynchronous nature of JavaScript and started running into issues where the files were being, or messages about the file being written were being returned before the file was complete. And I was getting multiple messages continuously when it was running for payloads and return results. So, well, I had to take a couple of days, and I don't know exactly where to start other than let me show you an example of what I'm doing now and where I'm at, and then let me kind of back up and tell you where it's going. So I have this function now that I can copy the server file. My file watcher will pick it up, and I do have a custom one here, and I'm going to go through and describe all of this. It then will parse out the file again like we expected, and I've added for the subnets this morning the ability to go out and generate the import format for IPControl. So I've done all of that, and in the result is just simply my payload showing that it was complete, and then my file, which now I have the results that I expected in this particular set. Now I created my own so I can work with this and actually show you what we have and kind of go through the process. And in this file now, in terms of the export, I can now have this particular import with the columns that need to be changed where applicable are identified by change me. And this is effectively the entire subnet block import CSV format that we need to import these into their respective containers or into IPControl. Right, so that was pretty seamless, I guess. There wasn't very much option in terms of what we could do with the data, but in terms of generating and getting the file up there and converted pretty quickly, that worked well. Now, in my example, when I built this file, just so you know, I had built out about 2,500 subnets, and then I built out a little around 12,000 IP addresses so that I could have some level of reservations to see in scale. And in the reservations, as you'll see here, basically just generating custom names, IP addresses, flagging which subnet they are, and then in the MAC address, I just kind of generated a unique MAC address, but as you'll see, these aren't actually valid. So anytime it generates a 0, it should do 00. It doesn't. So I need to go back and at least test that, but that's in the future. I just wanted to get to this point so that I could see in scale what was happening. And once I brought this up in scale and started working with a file that was a little over 5 megabytes, again, with that many subnets and addresses, that's when I started seeing the issues. And where I was copying the first file before, it was fast enough that I didn't notice this. So lesson learned, first thing to do, always test and scale. So if you're doing anything and you expect that you might have some level of size or something, triple it, quadruple it, maximize it so you know exactly what's going to happen in the end. Okay, and the second thing that I noticed as I was working through this, I had initially started off with one of these file watcher nodes, and the watcher node actually, that was just watching the directory. And every time I noticed when I was copying files, it was watching for every event. And as a file was being copied into the directory, it was copying in chunks. So this 5 meg file was broken down into chunks of whatever size was necessary. And each one of those was generating a statement, which was then going through and making me process this whole thing over for each portion. And that was absolutely not what I wanted. And then lastly, I had some way that I needed to go back in and modify and monitor the files being written so that I had to wait indefinitely until those were done, then pick up and attach those to the email and then complete. So, I've got it working pretty well now and actually doing the things I needed to do. So I'm going to kind of go through the custom areas in the flow, and let's see if we can keep this in a shorter video and kind of walk through the functions. It's pretty intense though when we get down into some of these capabilities. So the first thing is I had to create my own watcher, and that turned out to be a little bit trickier than I expected. in order to trap on the types of events that were being returned by the underlying operating system when a file was copied. So the very first thing I had to do is do about 100 searches on the internet to find out what was out there that I could do this with. And so what I found, first of all, is that there was a way to, through Node-RED in the JavaScript functions, to write to the FS or file system JavaScript nodes. But in order to do that, you also had to modify some settings, and very specifically, in the function global context block, you needed to enable the fs require fs. So effectively what this does is you can require other modules that are available in the underlying JavaScript or Node.js, and you can require those at this level and then make those available to the underlying Node-RED nodes via a global context. And so you can call that context, store it locally into the flow as a variable, which might be your function, and then call those functions or object capabilities through that global context. And that turned out to work very well. So the first thing you do is you need to edit that file, the settings.js, enable the FS, and you need to stop and start your Node-RED. All right, so I'm assuming again that you're running this on a Linux, that this is not part of the CAA settings, and that you're doing this in your own lab and not part of the production system. So make sure these things work and that you're doing this on a Linux Node-RED. So to use that function then, I had then set up basically a subflow that in this subflow, I want it to start automatically whenever my flow starts. So I added an inject node and set it up to start one time when it initiates so that it would create this watcher each time the deployment was complete or anytime the node started up. And I noticed a few other things which we'll go through here as well. So this then is creating our FS2. I have another one in here, but this then allows me to create a variable that's going to reference the context, which is that settings file, and the FS specifically. I'm then going to create a watcher, which I'm going to call endr, and we're going to, well, endr is a directory, and then a watcher in, which is going to watch the endr effectively. Now, I didn't really set this variable. That's what I'm going to do here. But the watcher in specifying the watch function is part of the FS module. So we do fs2 basically .watch, and then we specify the path, which can be a directory in this case with the watch. We could also use a watch file, which is actually allowing you to specify watching that a file changes or is added or renamed. And then I'm going to set it up to be persistent, that it's always going to watch this. And then it's going to create a callback function that's going to pass back the event, which is effectively the type, and the file name of the event that's being modified. So when a file is being copied or changed or deleted. And then I'm going to just write this out to the log so I can see it there. And then I introduced just something interesting for the node so that I could get some status indicator on the different functions. And you can do that through the node.status, specifying some type of fill color, a shape. I'll let you look at the API documentation for that. And then the text that you want displayed on the canvas as you're doing it. Now, through trial and tribulation here, and by clicking and copying files at least 1,000 times, I came to the realization that the event that I really want to trap on is a rename event on Linux. There's a change event, which is effectively the chunk that I was talking about that I noticed was being updated. And then the rename is the type of event that's telling me the file is being copied and that is basically closed and or deleted at that point. If it's deleted, I'm really not doing much, but it captures an error because it tries to open a file that's no longer there, and that kills that process. But this particular one, when it's renamed, it is then actually the file I want that I've discovered. And it's through this event callback where I do an if statement that I'm going to then prepare a message that's going to be sent. And this sent message is going to be captured into the next statements for our file name. So here I'm going to create a new message. I'm going to create the file string, which is going to represent the file name and an event. So in this case, I'm telling it what event it is for troubleshooting, and that gets passed out to our debugging there. And then I want to set up a payload, which I'm then going to define a file name variable. Actually, the payload, which is our payload with the event type, but the file name is what we're going to pass, which is capturing the directory. So the first thing to note about this watch is it did not pass back the directory name. I had to concat that to the file name that was passed back. I'm sure that could be in there somewhere. It might be an extra function. I'll look into that further. We might find it. But in this case, I just went ahead and did the ender plus the file name, which I know then is going to be up under the new ready, whatever the file is. And then the event is going to be effectively rename in this case. And because this is asynchronous, I'm going to then send this message, which is going to send it on to the next node in the process, which is actually the file node, which reads the file and processes it. Now, because I'm working with this file S, this global context, I noticed that whenever I did a redeployment, that it would recreate a new watcher every time I did this, and eventually it just got to the point it would crash the system. So I had to go back and clean up my asynchronous code. So this is asynchronous, and it starts up this global watcher, which we need to close every time we do a redeployment. So I have this now watcher in close in this function that tells it to close it. Then it reestablishes a new one as it restarts. And I found that that corrected my duplication of these queues and quadrupling and so forth. And that therein is our function that we're now doing for the monitor, and then I'm just passing it to the output. And the way that this works then is when these nodes are actually on the canvas, if you want to create a subflow, you select the nodes you want, highlight the subflows, and collect selection to subflow. And when you do that, you'll then end up with this particular node looking function, which when you edit, you click Edit Flow template, and it brings you up to the ability to edit the inputs if you want additional input left-hand handles, how many outputs you want, and then your function and other capabilities. You can also give it a name, and then you can use this or reuse this at later points within your functions. All right. So we got that. I didn't have to change anything with the file, nothing with the XML, nothing with the payloads. We still want that process, but we have a lot of function that we have to go through now in terms of processing this out. And it's getting a little dirty, and I'm going to have to go back, I think, and again, clean this up now that I know how this is working and start moving things into their proper context and into global variables that I can call. But here's where we go, and this is getting really messy, so I'm again not done with this yet, but I'm working towards it. So the first thing is we are still pulling in our scopes, and I now have a bunch of arrays that I'm working with. If you might remember, I started off with a bunch of scope objects, or maybe not. So let's go through this and kind of freshly look this over. So I'm building a couple of arrays, one for the scope objects, one for the scope CSV, and then also for the reservation objects, the reservation CSV, the options and option CSVs. And then I'm also going to do one for the IPC blocks, which will effectively be the array of CSV import for the IPControl block import. So that's how that's going to be represented in this array. This was my actual first watcher where I had set a context, then I'm watching for a file to be dropped into the payload, right? So this is going to be for the output here. So this output is watching for the files that are going to get processed in the output and for writing this. So the FS is going to represent the write in this case. I apologize. And then the second thing I want to go out and create a variable that's going to reference a global context variable, which is actually a function I have found on the internet that's called netmask2 CIDR, and that allows you then to convert the subnet mask to a CIDR address and then pull that information back. Now, I'm going to go into that in another video, but actually let's go ahead and do it now. But the mask to CIDR is stored down into a separate function and a global function. And I've effectively just copied and pasted this. So look it up and give some credit to the author who's there. And I'm going to do the same when I'm done with this. But effectively, this allows you to then create the variable. This is the function that's going to be used that I then set into the global function or variable net mass decider, and passing it the variable which is actually the function representation. And we do the same thing with the reverse counter that would then return the net mask. And we then set the global set for the decider to net mass function as well. Because I want this to be global, I again set up an inject node that inserts the timestamp and tells it to inject it at least once when it starts. And this will then load up that function or all of our global functions into their global context. And then as I'm going through my functions in the flows, I can represent that by creating a local variable, calling the context, doing a get, and pulling down that string or type object. And so that's what I've done. And then for this subnet function, I'm going to create it above the loops that I'm going to run to. I'm also using the status here to let it know that we're processing the scopes. And I'm, again, using a header string, just creating a string that is effectively going to be used for the block output header column, the first column. And this is just telling us what all those different columns are in a string. And I'm pushing it into the first element in the array for the IPC blocks that'll be returned to us. So that's effectively what I'm doing there. And then I'm going to walk through the scopes. And I'm going to pull out the scope ID because I'm going to use this variable elsewhere. I'm going to pull out and create a couple of different object types, one called scope and one called block. And the scope variables I'm going to set based on the underlying loop scope. So the scope A, pulling out the variables I want. I'm then going to join those object values into a string that's comma delimited, and I'm going to store that as underscore CSV. And this line turned out to be very helpful to take an object and join those as CSV. And then I push that into that scope CSV block, which at this point I'm not using, but I'm going to come back with that troubleshooting later. And then I'm going to call the net mask function. So this is how we're going to call that global variable that gets that mask CIDR conversion for us. So I'm going to set a local net mask variable, telling it what the subnet mask is, then setting the CIDR, then running the function passing the net mask. So the rest of this functionality then is we have block. I'm going to create the block structure, filling in the variables. So change the CIDR all the way down through the various functions. You can kind of look at the documentation to determine this list. And then lastly, again, I'm going to join this new string into its object notation, creating this into its array, and then pushing that into its stack. Now the option values, I've gone and done the same thing, joining those. I haven't done much with these yet, so I'm going to come back to it. And I'm going to have to do something different with the reservations as well. So hopefully when I get to those two functions for setting up the different IPControl imports, I'll have cleaned all of this up as well. But so you can see what we're doing with the option values. Again, just doing a for inner loop, parsing through the option value option lengths, and creating an option object that I'm going to push into the CSV stack that I'm going to later call out when I generate the file. And then I do the last same thing with the reservations. Again, converting the IP int, setting up a reservation object, and then pushing that information into a array, which I'm later going to use. So this is where we're going to get down into our writing of the files and where I had to kind of work around this asynchronous nature of writing objects and how JavaScript works. And I was having issues with this. So I found a couple of functions to work with this initially, but I don't know how they're going to scale, so this may change. So read into this if you can, but so far it's worked okay with me in multiple examples. So again, I want to go through and parse each three of those arrays to make sure their length is greater than 0. I actually probably want to take that off because I have some other functionality later that I'm going to use. But in this case, I'm going to set the file name. I'm hard coding this for now. I'm going to change this again later, but for testing purposes. Then I had found that when I was creating this array, if I just attached the array to the message and sent that message or created an output, that it was skewing the columns over one column. So the first record was always correct, but then everything else shifted one column over, and I just could not figure out the difference or why. So I decided I had to go back in and process each of the different array elements and create a new CSV string with a new line constructor that I then was writing to the file. And I found that that worked properly. So I had to do that for each of these different arrays. I'm going to look into that further too. Now here's the challenge, and here's where I had to spend almost 2 days and nights doing this, mornings and nights, not during work. That in this file, this FS that we're creating, the file system object, there is a write file, which is effectively asynchronous calling of this. And I found that when I was writing the file asynchronously, that I was getting 2 messages in return, and I didn't want 2 messages because I didn't expect 2 messages. So I wasn't sure how to handle that necessarily, and or know if it was going to be consistently 2 messages every time I read a file. So I decided against it for now. I'm going to revisit it, but I chose instead the write file sync, which effectively blocks the Node.js event flow until this process is done. So it allows me then to write this and blocking this function while I write to the file. And when this is complete, if it's an error, it'll throw the error, log it. And then when it's complete, I'll then get one message through the rename, which I'll show you in the other watcher. So this turned out to be the right way to do this for now, and it may change again as I figure out the asynchronous nature of the writes and the watching of that. I then did the same thing with the reservations. And again, I had to parse this out, create the new line, do the write file string. And this was all effectively duplication at that point, which again, I can simplify this through custom functions and headers and stuff. And then lastly was the options, doing the last thing of this. And again, setting our nodes and status. And I just really wanted at the very end of this node just to put an OK. And I really don't think I want that there. I should have with whatever the last status was. Since it is asynchronous, it would just put that in and read it anyway. So that's our function. And as you'll see, there's nothing else attached to it. So when this is done writing, that's the end of the process. And I'm just having a debug node at the end. Now, the whole process of this then is watching for those 3 files to complete their functions so that we can then process each. So I had to go out again and create another global context that I could do for the file system node locally. I then had to create another watcher for this that I'm looking then into another directory called complete, again doing persistent with event and file name. Now, for whatever reason, and I'm still yet to figure this out, that the event in this particular case, I'm getting changes, and I believe that's because of the way that the file system node does a write file. It does a change event versus the rename event. So this again took me, I don't know how many other hours to figure out the difference. I'm not 100% sure that's the correct way to do this, but it seems to be working for me and allows me to set up a different flow that I can monitor. So the events change. I might try this to rename at some point, but for now it's changed. Setting up again the file name in the event, the new payload object, setting up the event type within the payload, and then calling the node send with a new message within the change event capture. So we know that that's the files written and we're done. Again, make sure you have your node.on with the close function. So if you're doing a renew, that this will close. And again, I'm not returning any status here because I only want to send a message if that file is returned a change status, meaning it's ready to deploy. And this again is wrapped into a subflow, and that subflow is just being linked into the next flow, which in this case is going to join the messages. So I still had a hard time with this because I have 3 files I'm waiting for. I was not getting, all of these messages consistently and or getting multiple messages, or I thought I was. So I ended up putting a join because I know that right now I'm going to expect that 3 files are written. And that's why I said I'm going to take out that if statement instead of checking it just to make sure it even writes an empty file, if nothing else. So I'm sending a message for each change notification that I receive. And that then, so that I didn't do it in a flow or function, and I can probably go back and do that. But then I'm expecting this join function that after 3 messages have been received to expect that it's now ready to be deployed. So I then am, with that join in array, just clearing the payload. I don't want a payload at this point. And then I'm going to use my mail function, which is going to allow me to set up the to from my global values that I have, and then to set up the subject, the return string, and the attachments that are going to go into my email. And again, I won't go into that necessarily the mailer function that I'm using because it's already defined. But if you want to use a mailer, you can set up your SMTP host, that the secure is true, its port, and then your user and password credentials. Right? So that is effectively the functions, and everything in place there then works very well with processing and is very quick. And so to go again over that process, I now have a 5 meg file, and I found that I have to go out and remove these files each time, so I still need to clean these up and copy them over, and then also go ahead and copy. So then the watcher watches for the files to be processed, and then processes the XML, parsing through the XML node. I'm then going to get a message status that is processing on my functions, where it's going to write those different files, and we've already finished that and written to our OK. And the output files are there, and we should, if we go back, have just received our file. So all of that is really very quickly done, and it turned out really well in terms of what I'm looking for. So now I've got a pretty good process that, without any type of user input, that I can start working on ways to automate the capture of the file, uploading it into a directory somewhere, or through a web page or some other function, processing it automatically, and then passing back the details into an email with the CSV we need to import the files. And we could, insert any other type of module and functionality for what type of conversion we do and how you want that output to be represented. So this, turned out very well, and this is very clean. And then from here, you can change these values to match how your IPControl instance is to be met. Now, some of these also are global values, and I do have a way within my utility that when I set these, then you set the output file, that it allows you to define this up front, and then it generates the information. So maybe the next step, or one of the steps in these next few videos, is to create an import form that I'm going to identify these variables up front, such as use this type container or use this type of DHCP server or policy, etc. And then have it, as it uploads the file, set those node values and properties, and then inherit that when it converts it. So maybe that's something that we're going to do as kind of an input form to allow you to specify those. But I want to get the automated side of this first so that it can be quickly sent up and down, and then I can attach it, say, to email to help do this, or file copies. So I got to tell you, that was a lot of stuff. So, word of caution when working with anything Node, JS, JavaScript in particular, is the asynchronous requirement. So make sure you're able to handle and call and wait for and do that functionality, if nothing else. Save you time. And if you have any questions about it, leave me a comment, because I did a lot of searches, and I've run this thing 100 times, at least, well, probably 1,000 times in the last 2 days, just testing. And I beat these things up to make sure, and that's where I'm at. So just wanted to show you that, and go from there. So that's video 3, and I'm going to come back with, I can see now a lot of these as we go through it. And then I'm going to go ahead and convert my next one here, the reservations, into their import format. And then I'm going to work through the options, which is a new format to me. So I'm going to get done with that. And then even provide the ability to specify whether or not you want to create a user directory, a temp directory, and ways of shuffling this information around so that we can have multiple clients doing all of this functionality at the same time and having dynamic naming conventions. So wow, that was a lot for me. And I hope somebody learned something from that and is able to use it. And let me know if I can help. And other than that, I may or may not have another video today or tomorrow. And if not, I'll talk to you soon. Take care. Have a great day.